So the subject on the program is great powers and the New World disorder. I'm very happy to talk about great power relations, but I think it would be very useful to think more broadly about the current crisis of liberalism and the current crisis of the liberal world order. And in particular, in this lecture, I want to ask and try to answer 5 questions. And the 5 questions are these. Is the liberal order dead? Is it over? Is Putin right? Is President Putin right when he says liberalism is obsolescent? The second question I wanted to answer is, in the West, we talk a lot about the rules-based international order. But does this concept remain valid? Is it a useful way to look at the world, to look at international politics, international relations? My third question is, well, yes, we can see that the liberal world order is in crisis. But are we seeing a new world order, a new post-American, post-Western, post-liberal world order? Or are we seeing instead a new world disorder? My fourth question is the classic Russian question of "Kto vinovat?" Who is to blame for the current crisis of the liberal order, or indeed of a rules-based international system? And finally, I want to answer the question, is a liberal world order still possible in the early 21st century? Or really, is it absolutely over? There are no chances to recover the cause of liberalism, to restore a liberal world order in some kind of form. So, first question, is the liberal order dead? I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know if it's dead or alive, but what is clear is that the liberal world order is facing its greatest crisis since the end of the Cold War. And we see liberalism in retreat across the world. For example, in the United States, we have a president whose America First realpolitik contradicts the very principle of a rules-based liberal order, except, of course, as defined narrowly by the Trump White House. Under Donald Trump's leadership, the United States, it acts as an old-fashioned great power. We so accustomed in this part of the world to think about American democracy promotion. There is no more democracy promotion from the United States today. In Europe, we are seeing the rise of illiberal democracies in Poland, in Hungary, and even in Italy. Across the world, authoritarian regimes have not only become more numerous, but also more repressive, I would say, as we have seen in Russia and China, but there are many examples. And the growing tide of authoritarianism around the world threatens to establish a new normal, a new sense of what it is to be normal. And this new normal is dominated by naked self-interest and the use or threat of force. Then we see regimes such as Turkey, even Egypt, which at one stage seemed about to become Western-style democracies. Well, in fact, they've lurched hard towards authoritarianism. Now, the crisis of liberalism not only jeopardizes the legacy of democratic achievements and of democratic values, But I think even more importantly, they weaken the capacity of humanity to address some of the most formidable challenges it faces in recent decades. What do we have? We have global climate change and the threat of environmental catastrophe. We have a renewed arms race and the renewed possibility of a major war. And we have the collapse, the impending collapse of the international trading system, and we have the rise of global poverty and inequality. So it's not just about restoring liberalism for its own sake, it's about undermining our capacity to address some of the most fundamental challenges facing humanity today. The second question: does the concept of a liberal international order still have any value today? Well, I would argue that such is the crisis of liberalism and of the liberal world order that the very notion of a rules-based international order has become discredited. And not just in countries like Russia or China or in Africa, but actually including in much of the West itself. The term rules-based international order has become a kind of empty symbol. It has become devoid of meaning. World leaders, Western democratic leaders, are reduced to uttering meaningless words, meaningless slogans, platitudes. Instead, what we, all of us, should be asking are three questions here. What are the rules in a rules-based international order? Who makes the rules? And perhaps most important, who abides by the rules? Who obeys the rules? But then you can also ask the question even, was there ever even such a thing as a rules-based international order? Because there are some scholars, for example, Malcolm Chalmers, who is a very senior person in the Royal United Services Institute in London, he argues there has never been one single rules-based international order. We have had three orders instead. A universal security system, a liberal political and normative order, the so-called Western system, and a universal, a global economic system. Excuse me. But whether you identify one rules-based international order or two or three, what is clear is that the fate of international order in general has never looked more uncertain. Consider the following. The system of international arms control is collapsing, not just between the United States and Russia, but also in relation to countries such as North Korea. Many of the conventions and understandings implicit in the post-World War II security system, such as the unacceptability of changing borders by force, well, these conventions and understandings have fallen by the wayside. The economic order today faces a similar existential crisis. As multilateral trade regimes are collapsing in the face of country first, my country first, America first, Russia first, China first, mercantilism, and the discrediting of Western-dominated institutions such as the World Trade Organization, the WTO. The Western liberal consensus is falling apart. Yes, partly because of American unilateralism, because of the actions of Trump, but also because of the actions of certain EU member states, illiberal democracies, such as I've mentioned, Poland, Hungary, Italy, but there are others as well. And democratic and authoritarian regimes alike are withdrawing or cancelling or abrogating international agreements at a rate not seen in decades. Just in the past 3 years, The United States has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, or rather it signaled its intention to withdraw from the agreement. It has cancelled the Joint Comprehensive Partnership with Iran, the JCPOA with Iran, and it has cancelled the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia. And of course, what's next is the START agreement, the Strategic Arms Reductions Talks Agreement, which is due to be renewed in 2021 between Russia and the United States, but many people think that will be the end. So this raises the question of, if the liberal order and a rules-based international system is in crisis, then что дальше? What's next? Well, the thing is, some people would say, oh, well, look, there's a new multipolar world order, post-Western order emerging. But I don't think there is one. I think there is very little sign of the emergence of a post-Western, post-liberal order. Yes, it's true. The United States and Europe are declining in relative terms, but they will continue to play critical, prominent roles in international affairs. It's true that non-Western powers, such as Russia and China and India, are increasingly confident and assertive. But they too face tremendous obstacles in trying to realize their strategic ambitions. In my opinion, multipolarity is just a slogan, and that also that non-Western powers have yet to demonstrate a capacity or even the will to build a new post-Western system and to develop new post-Western norms and effective institutions. So what does this leave us with? It leaves us with an international environment that is more fluid and unpredictable than at any time since the end of the Cold War. There is an enormous strategic, political, normative void, a vacuum. There is no functioning international rules-based system of any kind, liberal, authoritarian, hybrid. There just isn't one. It's true that we're moving into a post-American era, but no one knows what this post-American, post-liberal era will look like. In short, we don't have a new world order. What we have is a new world disorder. And this has a number of features. First, a lack of clarity. At least during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union played according to certain rules of the game. They knew roughly where the red lines were, and therefore they didn't step over these red lines. Today, that is no longer the case. The lines are blurred, and the rules of the game are unclear. The second feature of the New World disorder is the limitations of great powers. Now, you often hear about, we're seeing great power diplomacy. The great powers are more assertive. Yes, they are more assertive, but they are also weaker at the same time. They have rarely, in fact, been weaker in their ability to influence events in the direction they want. For example, they can't get, even the United States, arguably the greatest power in the history of the world, is not able to defeat what many people regard as a Stone Age country in the form of Afghanistan. Russia may intervene in Ukraine, but it is unable to get Ukraine to do its will. And in the same time as you have the weakening influence of the great powers, non-state actors, multinational corporations, international terrorist organizations, non-governmental bodies, social media organizations. These non-state actors have demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to influence, to shape public thinking. Third critical feature of the New World disorder is what I call the de-universalization of international norms. We live in an era of moral and cultural relativism, in which the pretense of universal values has been largely abandoned. Global governance has become a self-contradiction. If we have a philosophy today, then that philosophy is one of narrow self-interest. Power and the right to exercise it freely has become the paramount virtue. Now, the 17th century philosopher René Descartes used to say, "I think, therefore I am." Today's world leaders operate on the basis of, "I can, therefore I will." And this leads me to my fourth feature, which is that we are seeing a general collapse of morals and ethics. We are living in a post-truth world. And in this post-truth world, anything goes. Anything is permitted. Truth has become almost entirely subjective, and it has given way to narratives. Again, this leads to my next point, which is, how's this been able to happen? Well, one of the reasons is we are witnessing a general crisis of international leadership. Not since the 1930s, 80 years ago, 90 years ago coming, has the quality of leadership around the world been so poor. This is evident in the inability and also the unwillingness of leaders to develop collective responses to some of the major global problems that face us today, be it climate change, mass migration, or arms proliferation. We find that tactical opportunism prevails at the expense of longer-term thinking. And of course, this has exacerbated xenophobic nationalism, political cynicism, and widespread public disillusionment. Now, in his lecture, Kostya talked a lot about international organizations and multilateralism. Now, one of the big problems that we have today is the shortcomings of multilateralism are so widespread and so obvious. On the one hand, we've never had so many international organizations, nor have we had a greater need for them. But it's also true that these international organizations have rarely been so ineffective. So you have the old organizations, the United Nations, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. Well, these organizations are struggling to remain relevant. And yet there is no sign that the newer international organizations that have been created, that are much talked about, the BRICS, the G20, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there are no signs that these newer bodies are capable of filling the growing vacuum of authority. But perhaps we're being unfair here, because we blame multilateralism, we blame the weakness of international institutions. But let's be honest here. International institutions, international organizations are only as good as their members. And so long as the great powers view themselves in exceptionalist terms, there is no hope that multilateralism can be made to work. Now, you often hear about the end of ideology, that international politics is no longer ideological, it's interests-based. Well, of course it's based on interests, but I would argue to you that ideology is as important as ever. Now, of course we don't have the old Cold War confrontation between capitalism on one side and communism on the other. That is over, yes. But instead we have new ideological conflicts between conservative authoritarian nationalism on one side and liberal internationalism on the other, between centrism and extremism from both right and left. Ideology hasn't disappeared. It has just become more fragmented. Now, in a climate of mistrust, collapsing norms, proliferating crises, I think that the likelihood of military conflict has grown substantially. Now, I'm not saying there's going to be a major war tomorrow, but the possibility of a major war can no longer be so easily and complacently excluded. Now, of course, no one wants a war. But if you recall your history, wars happen generally not through specific intention, but by accident, as a result of misperceptions and miscalculation, and indeed complacency. And the final feature of the New World disorder that I want to put to you is what I see as runaway globalization. You hear about deglobalizing trends. And to some extent, you can see where people who argue this, where they're coming from. It is certainly true that countries are pursuing ever more egoistical approaches to their national interests. However, we live in an ever more globalized world. Our interests, our problems, they transcend national boundaries. Information is everywhere. Culture is global. And problem solving is beyond the capabilities of any individual power, no matter how powerful. Western-led globalization may be obsolescent, but globalization itself is unstoppable. The question is, what forms will the new globalization take in coming decades? And on whose terms? So now I want to come to the question of who's to blame for the current crisis of global order. Well, living as I do in the West, everyone likes to blame China and Russia. China and Russia are said to form an axis of authoritarians whose purpose is nothing less than to destroy the entire post-World War II global system. But I ask this question, is the China-Russia partnership as close as it seems? Are Beijing and Moscow engaged in a common enterprise against the West? Or does the real threat to the global order, to the liberal order, come from within that order? Now, as I see things, there's little doubt that some Russian and Chinese actions are worrying and do pose a real threat to Western interests and to global order. And it's the usual suspects. It's hostile cyber activity by both countries. It's Russian political interference in democratic elections in the West. It's Moscow's annexation of Crimea and intervention in Donbass. It's provocative actions by the People's Liberation Army Navy in the South China Sea, forced technology transfer and unfair trade practices in China. Yes, these are problems for the West and for the liberal order. However, I think all this talk about a China-Russia conspiracy to destroy the rules-based international order is nonsense. I think although China-Russia cooperation is growing, Beijing and Moscow have shown little capacity or even will to coordinate on grand strategy. In the West, we forget that China and Russia are individual, separate actors, which each pursue their own agendas. Now, sometimes Chinese and Russian interests converge, and at other times they simply don't. And I think disrupting the liberal world order is not a shared aspiration between Beijing and Moscow. Because while both sides agree that this order, this liberal order, is unsatisfactory in many respects, they draw very different conclusions. So, Moscow's view, I think, is almost entirely negative. It sees a system that was imposed on Russia as the loser in the Cold War, and that has systematically deprived it of influence and status. And therefore, unsurprisingly, the Kremlin would like to see an end to this so-called liberal world order. I think the Chinese have a very different position. I think they want to see what they would see as the reform rather than destruction of the liberal international system, because they recognize that US-led world order and that Western-led globalization has been crucial to China's extraordinary transformation over the last 30 years. So that if Russia has been the biggest loser, the biggest casualty of the liberal world order, then China has been its largest beneficiary. And I think the Chinese have another problem, which is this. If you destroy the existing world order, the liberal world order, then what might replace it? Because they worry, the Chinese worry that if after the liberal world order is not a new, tidy, authoritarian world order, it is actually anarchy. The Chinese fear an escalation of international tensions. And they also recognize that any direct challenge to US primacy will increase the chances of confrontation with Washington. And that's not only bad in itself, it also means that it will complicate China's continued rise. Now, some Western commentators say that Xi Jinping has this vision. There's a slogan in China called a community of common destiny. And that this reveals that China is looking to create a new post-Western world order. Now, of course, I cannot exclude that this may eventually become Beijing's objective. But they are nowhere near ready. The implementation of any such vision is a very, very long way off. And it's worthwhile pointing out that if the Chinese wanted to create this world order made in Beijing, if you like, they would face tremendous obstacles from, including the opposition of other great powers, and I would say including Russia here, the dangers of strategic overreach, and of course competing domestic priorities. And so I just don't see that there's any evidence of such strategic ambition in Beijing today. So this brings me to, well, what are the real reasons for the crisis of the liberal world order? Well, I don't think they come from China or Russia or even from a so-called authoritarian international. They come from within that liberal order itself. And there are four key problems here. The first is the failure of Western democracies to live up to the principles of a liberal, rules-based international order. The United States, in particular, has been a serial rule breaker, not just under Trump, but actually previously under George W. Bush. American exceptionalism has encouraged other great powers to take an exceptionalist approach to their conduct of international relations. That's the first problem. The second problem is the sheer incompetence, the sheer ineptitude of Western policy making. And this has been highlighted by the failed wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, in Libya, in the indecision over Syria. The problem here is this. Western actions are not only regarded in much of the non-Western world as morally illegitimate, but they have also exposed the limits of US and Western power. It's one thing to be immoral, but if you're incompetent as well, that's a really bad combination. Third cause, the unsoundness of Western economic institutions and policies. The problem with the 2008 global financial crisis was that it undermined not just the West's economic credibility, but the West's moral and political credibility. It undermined the assumption that the West is best. The West is no longer best, it's clear. And Western governments were very, very slow to learn the lessons from this crisis. And finally, and these reasons are all sort of closely related, I would identify the domestic policy failings of leading Western countries in the decades since the global financial crisis. In the past, we've always made this assumption that there's been this association between liberal democratic governance and good governance. Well, the last decade experience of domestic policy failures in the West has broken this connection between democratic liberal governance on the one hand and good governance on the other. The liberal West, as a result, is no longer seen in large parts of the world, and indeed in the West itself, as a model to follow. So what Russia and China have done is that they've exposed the shortcomings of the West. They've taken advantage of the opportunities of the West, that the mistakes of the West has given them. Now, you can say that's immoral, but you can also agree that it's a pretty natural reaction. Now, in 2016, yes, I personally have no doubt that Moscow interfered in the US presidential election. But it wasn't Moscow's interference that got Trump elected. It wasn't Moscow's interference that decided the outcome of the Brexit referendum. These were self-harming acts made at home, and they reflected widespread disillusionment in mainstream democratic politicians, institutions, and values. So this brings me to my final question, which is, well, things are so bad, can we fix them? Can we do anything about it? Or do we say, well, do we agree with Vladimir Putin and say, liberalism, it's obsolescent, it's over, time to turn a new page here? Well, it's certainly true that there's a growing disconnect between the demands of an ever more complex and globalized world and the illusory promise of simple, straightforward solutions. And there's little sign of the international cooperation that we need to address global challenges like climate change, and alleviating poverty, preserving free trade, and so on. So in these very unpromising circumstances, what can we do to revive liberalism and to restore some kind of functioning world order? Well, I have some thoughts which I'd like to share with you. I think the first thing we in the West, we liberals, whether we're in the West or not, we should stop complaining, we should stop whining about the faults of other sides. There was a leading Asian specialist, Evan Feigenbaum, who said, whining is not a policy. Complaining is not a policy. Neither is stamping one's feet or sermonizing hypocritically about liberal values when we ourselves choose to discard them, to ignore them. The viability of liberalism as a basis for domestic and global governance lies in our own hands as liberals. Second, we should be under no illusions, because even in the most optimistic scenario, future problem solving in international trade and security and the environment will be a lengthy and difficult process. Third, we need to understand that some of our past assumptions about global order, for example, the idea that a single, cohesive, international system is the natural order of things, we need to accept that some of the assumptions are no longer valid. We need to, therefore, to think more creatively and innovatively about the building blocks of a new international system. Fourth, we should accept that US political, economic, and moral leadership in the world is over. And this is regardless of whether Trump is re-elected in 2020. International society is moving into a post-American era. The only real question is, what form will this take? Now, of course, the United States will remain the leading power for at least the next decade, could be several decades for all I know. But the only viable future for global governance is collective. And I completely agree with Kostya on this. Now, some people say, but you could have a great power-based order, Yalta 2.0, concert of great powers. I think such visions are not only immoral, but hopelessly unrealistic. The world's problems are far too complex to be solved or managed by great power accommodation and so-called grand bargains. Because unless we have a more inclusive approach involving diverse types of international organizations, smaller states, non-state actors, there will be no serious progress in addressing major global shortcomings. Yes, multilateralism is annoying. Yes, multilateralism has many shortcomings. But multilateralism, in the end, is the only way. Excuse me. Fifth, we should recognize that the era of Western-led globalization is ending, as I mentioned. So the task, therefore, for East and West, North and South, is to channel globalization in ways that would make it as attractive and as vital to people in the developing world as in the developed world. It has to be as appealing to someone, say, living in sub-Saharan Africa as it is to someone living in Stockholm, for example. Sixth, strategic flexibility. That is the way of the future. All countries, doesn't matter whether they're democratic or not, they will need to engage more fully with a diverse range of partners, as well as with multiple regional and global institutions. Many of our groupings will not be based on shared values or traditional alliances, but will be based on specific convergences on specific issues. Seventh, and perhaps this is the most important, Western decision makers have to address the disjunction between the rhetoric of liberal values and aspirations and the dismal realities of narrow nationalism and amoral realpolitik. So for the West, for the liberal West, that means internationally addressing problems such as climate change and global poverty. Domestically, it means demonstrating not just to others, but to their own populations, that liberal democracy is effective and not just virtuous. And that means confronting xenophobia, social and economic justice, and the erosion of the rule of law head on. Because in the end, if we're not able to restore the integrity of liberal norms, values, and institutions, we cannot expect others to respect, much less follow them. And I think my final point is really that, and maybe this doesn't really come naturally to international leaders, a little bit of modesty here is called for. All countries need to be self-critical. No one has a monopoly on wisdom and virtue. And to pretend otherwise is not only offensive to others, but it's actually self-defeating. Because ultimately, success in the world will come to those nations and societies that are best able to address their own weaknesses and to move beyond short-term thinking and narrow views of the national interest to embrace a larger understanding of the global good. Thank you.